Hi guys, and thank you for clicking on my video. I want to talk about Andrew Morton's The Queen book, and in particular, I've been reading the book, and for those of you who don't know, Andrew Morton was also the author of Diana, Her True Story, where Diana was sending tapes she was recording tapes, sending them to her friend, who was then sending to Andrew Morton, or rather, her friend was coming and picking them up and sending them to Andrew Morton, and Andrew Morton would then ask questions and she'd answer them on these tapes, and then he'd send her manuscripts of the book and she'd correct things and blah blah blah. So he was the one who came out with the book about Her True Story. So he also wrote a book about the Queen, and it's actually quite a good read. I mean, I think he's such a good author and royal commentator and or historian, if he classifies himself as such. I mean, I would. So what I want to talk about particularly in this video is chapter 12. Chapter 12 is called Flowers, Flags and Fortitude. Now, this chapter, before I tell you why I want to talk about this chapter and what this chapter is about, please do subscribe to my channel so that my channel can grow, and please do engage in the video, like, subscribe, press the bell button, share it with others, because that will help my channel grow, because I think that's how it sort of works on YouTube, is if there's more sort of interaction with the video, then it will grab more attention. So please do subscribe and share and like and comment. So the chapter 12, which is Flowers, Flags and Fortitude, is actually about the death of Princess Diana. Now, we all know, obviously, she died in 1997 and died very tragically. And this particular chapter, if you think about it, it's written, obviously, it's a book about the Queen. So it's almost like, if I can make such a comparison, like the series The Crown, right? The Queen is the focal point of that series. It is the Crown, and it's from the perspective of her life and her life story and how her life progresses from obviously a infant all the way to, you know, wherever it is that the crown is going to end. But it's the duration of her life, and then all these other stories around her and all these other players that come into her life. And obviously one of the key players is Princess Diana, and one of the key moments in the Queen's life is the death of Diana. So this isn't written from the perspective of Diana, although obviously Andrew Morton had a lot of involvement in Diana, and I'm guessing knew her quite well. But this is written from the perspective of the Queen's life and kind of what was going on within the royal family. So what I find quite interesting is to read from the perspective of what was happening within the royal family and their reactions to Princess Diana's death and what was kind of going on. And what was really interesting also is the reaction of certain family members, like, for example, Princess Margaret, and I will go into that in a moment, which I found quite surprising. Now, this is a really interesting chapter because, first of all, we know that the next season of The Crown is going to deal with the death of Princess Diana. And so it will be interesting, now that I've read this chapter, to see how they portray this scene. Because, again, as I said, it's not from the perspective of Princess Diana or about her life. It's actually about the life of the Queen. And so this book is obviously written for the life of the Queen. And so I would suspect that the Crown's episode would be quite similar. I would suspect that the researchers have used Andrew Morton's book, or at least his books. And also, we know that there is a movie called The Queen, and that was also written from the perspective of the Queen herself and the impact of Diana's death on her, and indeed on the Crown and on the royal family. So this is why this particular chapter for me is the most interesting in this book. So the chapter starts off, it's page 292, and it starts off by setting the scene in August 1997, which was of course the summer holidays for the children. So William and Harry, children at that point, and also Zara Phillips, who is Princess Anne's daughter. So it's obviously the Queen's grandchildren are having their summer holiday. They usually spend their summer holiday in Balmoral, which you'll remember is in Scotland. It's in a very remote area, and it's where the Queen died. It's one of her favourite places. I believe it was bought by Queen Victoria, and she used to love spending her time there. You may or may not know, but the Queen Mother, who is Queen Elizabeth's mother, she was Scottish. So the Queen herself was part Scottish, and as I understand it from what I've read and what I've heard, that the royal family love Scotland. Obviously, she is the Queen of Scotland, or was the Queen of Scotland, and Charles is the King of Scotland. And they love their summer holidays in Balmoral because they get to be alone. There's a lot of privacy. It's very remote. They love the outdoors. They love their horses. They love their rivers. They love their fishing. They love their hunting, etc., etc. So it seems like quite an idyllic time. And my understanding at this point in 1997, which is obviously after the divorce of Princess Diana and Charles, my understanding is that they had shared custody. So the children would spend their time with both parents. And in the summer of August 1997, obviously the summer holidays are shared between the parents. And the first part, it seems that William and Harry were with Diana and Dodie on the yacht and in Europe. And then they spent the rest of the summer with their father in Balmoral, and the Queen and members of the royal family and their cousins, etc. So this is setting the scene. They were obviously at Balmoral at the time that Princess Diana dies. So they're in Balmoral spending their summer holiday. So William and Harry had just come down from the hills, and they were playing with their cousin Zara Phillips in the grounds of the castle when the phone rang. And the phone was obviously their Princess Diana. She had just landed in Paris. She was due back in London the following day and was keen to touch base with her son. So that's obviously extremely tragic that she was going to come back home the following day. Harry was too involved in his game, and he didn't want to spend much time chatting. And then, so his conversation was very short and very monosyllabic. And the princess suffering and frustration, every mother knows. At that point, it was quite clear that Harry just wanted to get off the phone and just wanted to do what he wanted to do. Basically wanted to do something else. He was preoccupied and he was too excited and too busy. And obviously, if you have heard Harry talk about this, he has expressed huge remorse and huge regret for not having spoken to his mother properly. And in this book, it's quoted. I can't remember necessarily what I said revealed Harry years later, but all I do remember is probably, regretting for the rest of my life how short the phone call was. And I've seen Harry talk about this, and he obviously expresses such huge regret, and you can see that it kills him inside. And I think it also, in my view, it contributes to this anger that he has about the death of his mother, because he's killing himself and kicking himself over the fact that he cut the conversation short, basically. And he can't go on blaming himself for the rest of his life. Like, seriously, there are some things he can blame himself for, but he cannot blame himself for that. He's a child, and at the end of the day, children can't necessarily make informed decisions. But also, how was he to know that that would be the last phone call he would ever have with his mother? And even if it was the last phone call that you will have with your mother, you're always going to still have the grief and the regret, and want to say things that you wish you could have said but you didn't say. You're always going to have it. There's never a, oh, I'm so satisfied with the last conversation I had and I was able to say goodbye. Like, that's a very rare and a very privileged thing to have. And frankly, he had no idea that was going to be, as children, you think that your parents are immortal. And so I don't think that he should have regretted doing that. Frankly, she at least got to speak to him, and she got to speak to her sons before she died, which he should be. He should have some comfort in that. William was a little easier to communicate with, as he wanted to speak to his mother about issues he had in his mind. The prince was worried about a proposed photo call that he had arranged to mark his 3rd year at Eton, his exclusive public school. Harry had been held back a year at Ludgrove. I don't really know why he was held back a year, but there we are. and William felt that the stage event would overshadow his brother. That's interesting. So William was worried about his little brother. It's interesting. It's a contrast to how Harry portrays him. Diana promised that she would discuss it with his father when she returned to the UK the following day. She had spent the last few days in the idyllic sunshine cruise with her boyfriend Dodi Al-Fayed, sailing around the Mediterranean on board the John Akal, the yacht owned by Dodi's controversial businessman father, Mohammed Al-Fayed, and now she was looking forward to seeing her boys. I've seen various documentaries and read various things about this time that she was having with Dodi in the summer. I've read so many different things that contradict itself that I don't know what is the truth. I've heard that she was in love. I've heard that she wasn't in love. They were really together for 2 or 3 months, I think 2 months at the time, and he was engaged to somebody else, that he broke her heart. He was a playboy. He was set up with her by his dad to entertain, even though he wasn't that keen. I've heard that he was going to propose to her when he drove from the Ritz to his apartment. There was somebody waiting there with the ring, and that's why he wanted to go to his flat as opposed to staying at the Ritz, which was against his father's advice, and that he had a ring waiting, that he was going to propose. I've heard that he wasn't going to propose, that he had bought a ring, but it wasn't an engagement ring. I've heard that Diana had a phone call or was speaking to Hasnet Khan, who is obviously the guy that she was in love with and was together in secret for, I think, 2 years or something, the surgeon, the Pakistani surgeon. And I've heard that there was communication with them and that they were going to meet when she came back, and that he was the one that she truly loved, and that she was playing to the newspapers and playing to the media, taking photos of her and Dodi, not so that it could make Charles jealous or overshadow Charles, which is what the mainstream media was saying, but so that it could in fact make Hasnet Khan jealous. So I've heard so many various things, but we will never know the truth, I guess. So the couple had flown from Sardinia to Paris on a private jet on Saturday the 30th of August. On arrival in the French capital, they briefly stopped at Villa Windsor, the former home of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, in the Bois de la Boulogne, then inspected Dodi's apartment before driving to the Ritz Hotel, where they planned to stay for the night. You may recall that I think Dodi's father, Mohammed Al-Fayed, owns the Villa Windsor. So during the journey, they were surrounded by motorbikes, riders, and cameramen travelling, who were desperately trying to get shots of the couple. Now, despite what Harry may think, and despite this international campaign he has against the British media and the portrayal he has made over in America about the British media, my understanding is that it was not the British media or any members of the British media that were part of the cameramen or paparazzi or journalists or whoever that were pursuing Diana at that moment when she died, is my understanding. So that was in fact the international press, and wasn't in particular the British press. So obviously it then goes on to talk about the tragic night, so how she died, which we all know, and then we get into the royal family. So it says at 1 o'clock in the morning on the 31st of August. So you've got to remember that at this stage people thought that Princess Diana was still alive, and I think she in fact was still alive. So the news was that she had an accident at this point. She was in a fatal car accident. So at 1 o'clock in the morning on the 31st of August, the Queen's assistant private secretary, Robin Janvrin, who was staying on the Balmoral estate, was woken up by a telephone call from the British ambassador to France, informing him of the accident. Janvrin was confounded. He hadn't even known that Diana was in Paris. He immediately threw on some clothes and alerted the staff in the big house to wake Her Majesty and other senior royals. By the time he had got there, the whole castle was stirring. The mood, one of bewilderment and confusion. What is she up to now? Asks the Queen. In a rare show of affection, the sovereign and her son physically consoled one another, perhaps sensing that this event was going to be emotionally unprecedented. So that's interesting. So the Queen and Prince Charles consoled one another. The Queen ordered a pot of tea, but never touched a drop, as she, Prince Philip, and Prince Charles paced the tartan-carpeted corridor, wondering what should be done. Early reports suggested that Diana had only suffered a broken arm and had walked away from the accident. Now, this is what's really tragic, is the differing reports, that it's just horrific. And I'm glad that William and Harry weren't told what was happening until later, because it's absolutely horrific. Her mother-in-law's initial response to the news was extraordinary. Someone must have greased the brakes. Her gnomic reaction shocked and puzzled her staff, who really heard her use such colloquial language. So this is the Queen speaking. An alternative view was that the Queen was not referring to Diana being the target of such a treacherous act, but to the possibility that one of Muhammad al-Fayyad's many avowed enemies had taken lethal action against his son, and Diana was the innocent collateral damage. Now, I've heard this theory before also, because you may recall that Muhammad al-Fayyad was one of the most vocal people about how Princess Diana was killed, she was murdered, they murdered her son, and, you know, it may have been the establishment, and there needs to be an inquiry, and blah, 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 blah. And what I found interesting is that I have also come across a theory that it was nothing to do with Princess Diana and nothing to do with the royal family, and that it was to do with Muhammad al-Fayyad and perhaps people that he had crossed or that he had owed money to, and therefore they were sort of seeking revenge, or I don't know if revenge is the right word, but, you know, and because if you think about it this way, as I understand it, Trevor Rees-Jones, who was the bodyguard, Diana's bodyguard, who was in the car, the only survivor, as I understand it, he was provided by the Al-Fayed team. And as I understand it, the car was provided by the Al-Fayed team. And as I understand it, the driver was provided by the Al-Fayed team. So if you think about it, I mean, you know, if somebody's after the Al-Fayeds, then they've probably got a way to do it. But anyway, and obviously Dodi was his eldest son, his, you know, his sort of heir, as it were. And so I have heard that, unfortunately, Diana was the collateral damage, and it wasn't actually anything to do with her. But there we are. Who knows? Who knows the truth? So sinister schemes, murderous intrigues, and cold-hearted conspiracies, anything seemed possible in the uneasy hours before dawn. As the minutes ticked by, the news became ever bleak. The family were told that paramedics were fighting to keep the princess alive. At one point, she was already on artificial respiration. God. Her blood pressure was very low, and she had suffered a major cardiac arrest. It's terrible, isn't it? Just reading this, I can remember that moment. Oh, God. I remember the reports that she'd been in a tragic accident, and then I remember the reports that she had died, and oh, God, it was in the early hours of the morning, and oh, it's terrible. While Prince Charles arranged to fly to France to be by Diana's side, Ambassador Jay relayed the terrible news that she was dead. So before the announcement that she was dead, Prince Charles was already wanting to get on a plane and already wanting to go and be by her side. So that is really intense, and that actually makes me choke a little bit, because I think he really, 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 really loved her. You know, he may not have been in love with her, or there may have been a time where they were in love, but obviously right now he's with Camilla, they're divorced, they're whatever. But when you have a deep love for someone and you care for someone, you know, she was so incredibly younger than him, and is the mother of his 2 children. And I think that there was a huge love for her. And when you go through, you know, you're young, you're embroiled in just mess and mistakes, and then you come through it the other end. So you're now divorced, you now can move on, and she's now moved on, and he's moved on, and then something like this, you know, your feelings of anger and resentment and whatnot can go. But then when something like this tragic happens, it's like a huge shock. And he probably felt a massive guilt trip, because he was supposed to look after her, obviously. And, you know, he brought her into this fold expecting such a huge ask of her, which was to be the future Queen of England. And then they've had such a life together, and they've seen so many things together and experienced so many things together, and then here she is, you know, in this tragic accident. And I just think it's so it's so telling that he wanted to immediately get on a plane and be right by her side and make sure she was okay. And then for him to get the news that she was dead, he must have immediately had his boys in the front of his mind. The news triggered all the swirling emotions that the Prince of Wales had hitherto been keeping under control. He wept, saying over and over, "What have we done to deserve this?" So, as you can see here, Prince Charles burst out crying at the news of Princess Diana's death. So what have we done to deserve this, he says. His first instincts were about how the public would blame him for the tragedy, an assumption that was largely accurate. So that's interesting, is that he immediately thought he's going to be blamed for this. And it must have been so painful and scary to experience that. But at the same time, it's probably due to a lot of guilt that he has of how he treated her. And, you know, not having had the chance to right some of the wrongs and apologize, perhaps. It was an issue that he had discussed at length with Camilla, who was at her Wiltshire home. So it doesn't seem that Camilla was in Balmoral. And his London-based aide, Mark Bolland, he feared that the world would go mad and it could destroy the monarchy. It was a measure of his character and position, torn between duty and self-interest, that his fears for the future of the monarchy became conflated with the concern and sorrow for his children who had just lost their mother. I mean, that's a lot of conflicting emotions. But I don't know if the first emotion I would necessarily have is, oh God, this is going to destroy the monarchy. Oh God, I'm going to get blamed for it. I think the first thing that would come across my mind is probably my boys, and probably how, you know, this is my ex-wife, my ex-love. And, you know, I've done so many bad things. And then also then probably, okay, damn, this is a royal family. Now, you know, they might blame me, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, everyone reacts to things differently. As the respective staffs of the Queen and the Prince of Wales tried to decide the official response to Diana's death, Her Majesty wisely ordered the removal of the radio and television in the boys' nursery. I think it's quite funny that it's still called nursery, but there we go. She did not want the princes to hear about the news. She did not want the princes to hear about the news from anyone but their father. William and Harry were her immediate and continuing priority. And I think that comes across in the movie The Queen. And it also comes across in the Queen's speech that she made when Princess Diana died and she returned to London. And she said, you know, I am a grandmother. And I think that people forget that that's why the Queen kept the boys and the family up in Balmoral for so long, and they weren't immediately wanting to return back to London to essentially face the media, face the public. You know, the priority for her was her grandchildren, which I think says a lot about her, because she's all about duty. But it seemed, even in the face of that, even though she's the mother of the country, essentially, or the grandmother of the country and the leader of the country and the Commonwealth, that her first priority at that point was her grandchildren. So I think that speaks volumes to her heart, really. You know, she's been criticized a lot about being a distant mother or not giving Charles enough emotion. But I think as she grew older, you know, perhaps as a 25-year-old young mother who's just been made queen, she may have made different decisions then that she might have regretted or might not have. But I think as she got older, and perhaps that can be seen for how she treated Edward and Andrew, because by then she'd been queen for so long and she was able to be a bit more present in their lives as compared to Anne and Charles in particular. So I think, you know, as she got older, she perhaps saw things differently. And so for her grandchildren, she put them as number one. Whereas I think in 1953 or 1954, that may not have been the case. And I don't know, frankly, when her father died and she had to step up and be queen, whether in the forefront of her mind was Charles and Anne. I think in the forefront of her mind was, I've got to step up and I've got to lead my country. The Queen had also been at Balmoral when Mountbatten was assassinated. Then, after processing the initial shock and disbelief, the royal family and their advisors knew that there was a roadmap for the funeral arrangements. Uncle Dickie had meticulously planned everything right down to the last medal and insignia for a disaffected Princess of Wales who had voluntarily relinquished her formal HRH appellation during the divorce negotiations. Everyone, including the monarch, was entering into unknown territory. So I think it's interesting to also point out that she had voluntarily given up her HRH, because I think there's this misconception that her HRH was taken away from her during the divorce. But that is actually not the case, because a lot of people sort of compare it to what's happened with Harry and Meghan. But I have also read elsewhere that it was given up by her voluntarily. Although Diana was the mother of the future king and his brother, since the divorce, she was technically no longer a member of the royal family. Not only did she spend much of her time in America, but she had also not attended family gatherings for several years. The last time the Queen had seen Diana was at William's confirmation in March, more than 5 months before. Initially, it was the express wish of the Spencer family that the funeral be a private affair followed by a memorial service. In quotations, "When I rang up," says one ex-courtier who was out of the country, "there was genuine uncertainty about whether the funeral, was going to be public or private. If it had been private, guidance wouldn't have been needed. In the meantime, the circumstances surrounding the interment of her boyfriend, Dodi Al-Fayed, had been swift and straightforward. Within hours of a prompt return to the UK, an Islamic funeral was held at Regent's Park Mosque, where his body was laid to rest at Brookwood Cemetery near Woking in Surrey." Now, that's because obviously the Al-Fayed family are Muslims, and in the Muslim faith, it is a tradition, and I think perhaps a requirement, that the body is to be buried as soon as possible, and it's usually done within 24 hours if possible. So while discussions continued apace regarding the most appropriate course of action for Diana's funeral, the new Prime Minister, Tony Blair, inevitably became involved. Based in his constituency in Durham, he immediately appreciated the global implications. He told his press secretary, Alistair Campbell, "This is going to unleash grief like no one has ever seen anywhere in the world." After further discussions between the Spencers, so this is Diana's family, the palace and Downing Street, the family accepted that a private funeral was inappropriate for such a much-loved public figure. The Queen's private secretary, Sir Robert Bellows, was pivotal. As he was married to Diana's sister Jane, he was able to steer the Spencer family towards accepting a more regal and public send-off for the princess. So it seems here that it was more of a push from the royal family for there to be such a big funeral, whereas the Spencers wanted a private funeral. And if you remember at that point, obviously Diana was divorced, so she was a Spencer, as it were. Back at Balmoral, Prince Charles readied himself to break the tragic news to his sons at 7:15 a.m. So if you can imagine, this started at 1 o'clock in the morning, and then now we're at 7:15. I mean, that's a lot of conversations. If you can imagine, that is how fast things move in the royal family. At 7:15, he woke 15-year-old William and told him of his mother's death. "I knew something was wrong," William later recalled. "I kept waking up all night." His father explained, I mean, that's quite sweet. "I kept waking up all night." I mean, at this point, the boys don't know anything, but William has obviously got quite a connection to his mum, or he's just a very instinctive little boy. So the fact that he was saying, "I knew something was wrong and I kept waking up all night," it's quite You know, that's quite spooky. His father explained that he had to fly to Paris so the boys would stay with their grandparents in Balmoral. Thank goodness we're all together, was the Queen Mother's immediate response. We can look after them. Her mood, according to a courtier, was steely. Like the rest of the family, she was trying to cope with the tragedy by sticking to routine. So if you imagine that the royal family and members of the royal family, and they're from a different era and they're from a different class, they're used to routine. That is their comfort, routine. The way things are, tradition, protocol, that is their comfort. And so especially for the Queen Mother who's speaking here, Queen Mother is from an Edwardian age, right? She's seen so much. She died over the age of 100. She died after Diana, I think after her daughter, Princess Margaret. She has seen so much, has been through so much. And so I'm not surprised that her reaction was quite steely, and, you know, she dealt with things and coped by sticking to routine. Fortunately, Princess Anne's son, Peter Phillips, and the prince's official companion, Tiggy Leg Bro, were guests at the castle, so they could help keep the children occupied. Before the Queen left for church, she spoke to the Prime Minister. By now, the family had released a brief statement saying the Queen and the Prince of Wales are deeply shocked and distressed by the terrible news. When she spoke to Blair, she made it clear that no further statement would be made, but she had no objection to him making a public tribute that morning. And then obviously he made his famous speech where he says, you know, she is the people's princess. He later recalled that she was most worried about the impact on the boys, obviously sad about Diana and concerned about the monarchy itself, because the Queen has a very strong instinct about public opinion and how it plays out. And in that first conversation, we agreed to keep closely in touch with it. He had only been Prime Minister for 4 months, and now he had to navigate an unknown and treacherous social terrain, namely the tensions between the Spencers, the Windsors, and also between the Prince of Wales and the Queen. Okay, and then it talks on about Tony Blair's emotional tribute and how he referred to her as the People's Princess, as I've said. So though his words were intentioned, the phrase People's Princess was not. Though his words were well-intentioned, the phrase People's Princess would not be received favourably in certain quarters. As Archbishop Carey watched him speak, he felt that Diana's alternative iconography would be set against the royal family, and so it proved. As he recalled, these fears were soon realised. There seemed to be mounting hysteria, fuelled by the media's focus on the beautiful but essentially ordinary person. Political observers believed that the Prime Minister's choice of words were not entirely welcomed by the Queen. It initially led to a degree of strain, which, as the week progressed, had largely dissipated. At the time, Prince Harry, nearly 13, was bewildered. He and his elder brother had attended the Sunday morning service at Crethy Church at the Queen's suggestion. Now, I don't think that the princes should have gone to church the next day. I mean, I get holier than thou. I get it. That's what you should do. Pray for your mother. But I really don't think they should have been there. And I think they were photographed, if I recall, if my memory serves me right. And I just don't think that they should have been exposed. I don't think they should have come out. I think they should have just stayed where they were. But there was no mention of his mother's passing in either of the prayers or the sermon. Instead, a visiting minister, Reverend Adrian Varwell, stuck to his prepared notes about moving house and joked about the Scottish comedian Bill Colony. Little wonder then that Harry asked, "Is it true that Mummy's dead?" While the Kirk's minister, Reverend Robert Sloan, explained later that he did not mention the late princess for fear of further upsetting the boys, it played into an emerging narrative that the royal family were cold and indifferent about Diana's death. That's unfortunate, but I can understand why he did that, and that's why I think the boys shouldn't have been there. And I do think that the royal families had really unfair criticism at this time. I think it's really unfair. I remember this time, and I do remember all the criticism, but I was really empathetic towards the royal family at this time. I was like, what do you expect them to do? Like, give them time. Give them, everything happened so quick. I think it was 7 days or something. Give them, when I say 7 days, I mean the whole funeral arrangements and the funeral. And I'm just saying, you know, give them time, give them space. Like, what's going on? This is so unprecedented. This is so tragic. You know, Diana was so young and died in such a tragic way. It's so tragic. Like, let people pause for a moment. You know, this is family. There are children involved, and there's, you know, protocol involved. There's convention. There's public money. There's, you know, that, like, pause for a moment. So certainly not every member of the family felt Princess's passing as keenly as others. Now, this is where I was quite surprised. So Princess Margaret had fallen out badly with Princess Diana after her appearance on the Panorama, where she questioned Charles' fitness to be king and talked of her ambition to be a queen of the people's hearts. Now, obviously, we know now that that Panorama interview with Martin Bashir, you know, it's something that obviously Prince William has condemned, and it is clear that Princess Diana was manipulated and lied to by Martin Bashir to get this interview. So when I look back at that interview and what she said, I don't take any of it, because she was manipulated to such a narrative that it is really unfair to then take on board what she says. Like, for example, she was manipulated to believe that she was being spied on, that her phone was being bugged, that her car was being bugged. So she was so paranoid. And then obviously when she then relays that information, well, that information came because you were manipulated, and then you were in a state of paranoia. So now you're worried that they're out to get you. Now you're worried that they want to silence you. You know, one of the things she said, they want to silence me, I won't go away. And then, you know, things like, I think she was manipulated to believe that Prince Charles was having an affair with the boy's nanny, and that she was presented with a document to say that this nanny had had an abortion. Now, how horrific is that? How horrific is that? So then you just think about her whole understanding, her whole paranoia, her whole mistrust, her whole perception of what is reality. And then when she speaks and says things in the interview, I just think, you know, like, for example, when she says he's not fit to be king, well, in the back of her mind, he's just gone and got someone pregnant and made her have an abortion. I mean, come on now. You know, these are one of the things you're going to say, yeah, he's not fit to rule the country. But, you know, we know now that obviously she was really manipulated. So I don't take that interview as valid at all. So Princess Margaret, obviously, maybe she would have had a different view if she knows now what we know. Not only did Margaret consider these sentiments a betrayal of the Prince of Wales, but as far as she was concerned, there was only one queen, and it was her sister. From then on, Margaret would have nothing to do with Diana, and she expected her children, David and Sarah, to ignore her too. As a result, she was deeply irritated by being obliged to stay at Balmoral in court mourning instead of flying off to Tuscany, where she was looking forward to her annual cultural holiday in the sun. So, quite harsh and quite savage. I would have thought that after a shocking death like that, that there would be something in your heart that would make you, you know, feel some grief, rather than, I want to go on my summer holiday. And actually, it's a really good idea that she was stopped, because heaven forbid she went on a summer holiday. Can you imagine the press? Oh my God, can you imagine the photos and the paparazzi? God, that surely would have contributed to the end of the monarchy. While complaining about the fuss, and also I don't think Margaret anticipated the scale of what was gonna come, whereas I think the Queen did. She knew what was about to come, and so it was such a good call to say, sorry, love, you ain't going on your holiday. So while complaining about the fuss that Diana had caused, Margaret was, like her sister, very much concerned about the impact on William and Harry. Oh, there we go, little heart. The Grinch's heart grew 2 sizes. So terrible to lose your mother at that age, and with little Harry's birthday only a few days away, she said. Just like the young princes, millions of people worldwide were disbelieving of Princess Diana's death, and they only had sight of the Bay 146 of the Queen's flight and the Princess's coffin on board, making its final approach to Paris, from Paris to RAF Northolt in West London. And the enormity of the loss had begun to sink in. Her coffin draped in with the royal standard was borne in silence across the tarmac by 6 RAF pallbearers watched by the Prime Minister and other government and military dignitaries. I mean, I remember that moment, and oh my God, it was horrific. It was just horrific. Just, oh God, just the memory of it right now is just making me choke, because it was absolutely horrific, because it was almost like our princess was coming home, and she was brought home. You know, when you see that plane landing, you're like, she's coming home, and then when they take her out of the plane, you're like, she's being brought home. And the fact that she was being brought home in a box, and then it had the royal standard, which obviously wasn't protocol because she was no longer a member of the royal family, but I think that was just a right decision that they made, which was maybe the Queen's decision, maybe Charles' decision, I don't know. But he obviously went over to go and collect her body, which I thought was amazing. He went over with her sisters, and there's that scene of when they come out of the hospital and the sisters are like teary-eyed. One sister's face is just completely distraught, the other one's like crying, and then you can see Charles's face is just so distraught, and it's just such a horrendous time. But I'm so glad that Charles did go, and again, that I think is testament to his love for the boys, to him being aware of what his role is, and his love for Diana, you know. And let's not beat around the bush. He may not be in love with Diana at that point, but he must have loved her as a companion, as a friend, as an ex, as whatever. You know, he married her when she was still a teenager. You know, she was 19 or 20. He has seen her grow. She was 36 by the time she died. He's seen her grow. He's grown with her. And you know, he must have felt such grief, which is obviously evidenced by this book, because he was, you know, crying his eyes out. If the Spencer family needed any further convincing that a private ceremony was wholly inappropriate, then the drive into central London along the A40 dual carriageway was further proof. Thousands of people, some openly weeping, lined the roadside or watched from bridges and other vantage points in the cortege drove past, her body taken first to a private mortuary in West London, and then to the Chapel Royal at St James's Palace, where she lay in state. So I'm going to leave it there for a moment. This chapter is quite long, so I'm really sorry, and I'm not a fan of these long videos. So I'm going to leave it there. This chapter is really long, so I think it's probably going to take me a couple of videos. But I'm going to leave it there, because we've got this point where Diana is now back. Her body is now back in London. So please do join me in my next video, because I'm obviously going to talk about the next part of the chapter. So Diana is now here. What now happens? And let me know if you're finding this chapter interesting. Let me know if you read this book. And yeah, if any of this information is new to you, you know, some of it is new to me. If you find any of it interesting, if you've got any other views, let me know. And I will see you in my next video. So take care, guys. Bye.